So my title comes from the idea that I want to convey a certain amount of humility here. I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. This lab is great. This is takes me back to my youth when some professor actually had apparatus here and gas going and experiments being demonstrated on the bench. It's a bit of a museum piece, I think, isn't it? Has anybody ever seen anyone actually do an experiment on one of these things? I don't think it happens at Davis anymore either, where I come from. People often have very strong and positive ideas about what happened in the past, when language evolved, when this evolved, when that evolved. And from my perspective, this is silly. It's really hard to know what went on in the past. It's really hard to know how things like language evolved. It doesn't fossilize, well, it doesn't fossilize until we get written language in the last few thousand years. Then we get cuneiform tablets and things like that. But the real origin events don't fossilize, and we ought to be a little humble about that. The philosopher of biology once observed that all evolutionary reconstructions of things like the origins of language are really stories, how possibly it might have happened stories. So that's where my title comes from. So what I want to do is give you a little insight into what people interested in evolution have had to say about language as an evolutionary phenomenon. And these people come from a wide variety of disciplines, like me, from evolutionary biology. Many people come from disciplines like linguistics. Steven Pinker, for example, whose book many of you may know, is a psycholinguist by background. And so people from diverse backgrounds have considered this question. And I'm not a linguist by training. What language I have has been picked up in conferences and from reading, and so I don't make claims to be a linguist. But I think that looking at language from the point of view of evolution, and particularly cultural evolution, gives different kinds of insight. So I want to give you a little, what I call evolutionary functional analysis of language. What do we use language for, and what might that suggest about how it evolved in the past? Presumably, the things that we use language for today, what it's important for today, are some clues, some imperfect clue as to the reasons that it evolved in the past. What social functions does it have? And it seems to me that, and I'm going to give you a little comparative analysis of communication systems. It's often said that language is unique and it has no parallels in the rest of the animal kingdom or amongst organisms in general. And that's, by my way of thinking, a half-truth, and I'm going to try to explain why I think it's a half-truth. There are other language-like complex systems, and where they occur is really interesting when it comes to an analysis of language. And what languages do, I'm going to argue, is two things. They support social institutions, mainly. The most important thing we use language for is talking to each other about how we should behave and things like that. Or at least that's a fundamental thing, that humans couldn't run the kinds of complex societies we run without language. The other thing it does is support boundary marking. So dialect variations grow up very rapidly along social fault lines. So one of the things we use language for is to signal what social groups we belong to and who the in-groups are and who out-groups are. It's not the only thing we use for that, but it's a very important symbolic marker of group boundaries. And it seems to me this is what generates a diversity of languages. This is the Tower of Babel problem, if you want. The evolutionary reason why we speak many different languages is because we have many different social systems and many reasons to distinguish in-groups and out-groups. And then it provides some direct and indirect support for technology. For, of course, modern technology, you need the shop manual to service a car and things like that. But for many things related to technology, it's one demonstration is worth 1,000 pictures, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. How to tie knots and things like that. No, but if you read a written description of how to tie a knot and then try to tie a knot, it's not easy. It can be done, but it's not easy. On the other hand, a diagram or particularly a demonstration works much better. You can quickly learn to tie a knot when somebody else shows you how to do it. So we don't seem to, a lot of things we might not have needed language for, relatively simple forms of technology. And then I'm going to argue that the evolutionary mechanisms of the origins of human language, the evolution of human language, are due to gene-culture coevolution, that both cultural evolution and genetic evolution played critical roles in the evolution of language. And I'm going to sketch a scenario for how possibly this happened. And this, more generically, this hypothesis goes under the name of the tribal social instincts hypothesis. So this is an idea that Rob Boyd and I developed out of my longtime co-author, and I developed out of mathematical models we've made of the cultural evolutionary process and the tests, insofar as we've been able to make them, of how the cultural evolutionary system works as a system of evolution. And the social part of this is the tribal social instincts. That humans in the Pleistocene lived in tribes. That is to say, groups of people that were far larger than kin groups. Groups on the order of hundreds to thousands of people that lived in a group that cooperated, interacted routinely in a cooperative manner, and that culture supports in-group cooperation, the evolution of in-group cooperation, and it also supports this boundary marking, and language plays a large role in both of these things. So that's where I'm going with all this. So evolutionary studies of language have exploded since the late 80s and early 90s. Most people point to a paper by Steven Pinker and Paul Bloom that was published in BBS, the Brain
Behavior Science.
Brain Behavior Sciences, thank you. I always know it by BBS, and I temporarily lost the translation. Thank you. So it appeared at BBS, and Pinker is, amongst linguists, is an innatist. He owes much of his intellectual ancestry to Noam Chomsky, who famously argued against any evolutionary theory of language. And Chomsky is, Pinker and Bloom is sort of Chomsky plus evolution. They argue stoutly that you can understand how language evolved. And they have a gene-culture coevolutionary hypothesis built into this. And by this I mean that what they think is that ancestral humans had some kind of call system, or maybe partly gestural and partly vocal communication system, and they had simple forms of social learning. They could learn from others, and when humans or proto-humans came under selection to communicate more, some of this communication would involve cultural elaborations of their existing innate call system, and so the new calls would be invented or old calls would be modified, and there would be a tiny little bit of a cultural modification of the call system. If that was favored by selection, if more communication along those lines was favored by selection, then selection would fall secondarily on the innate part of the language system to expand the capacity of individuals to communicate, and that would allow the cultural part of the system to cause still further elaboration, and during the evolution of language there would then be repeated rounds of gene-culture coevolution. Whatever the existing innate capacity was, cultural evolution would try to stretch the boundaries of that, and individuals whose innate capacities allowed more stretching in the direction of permitting more sophisticated cultural modifications of language would be favored. And eventually we'd end up with a the kinds of languages that we speak in the world today, these extremely impressive, complex, grammatically organized communication system. And Pinker and Bloom suggest that much along the lines of the earlier Chomsky, that much of the machinery that made this happen would be innate, that there'd be still be a strong genetic component to that strong innate component to that system. In fact, the innate component would have been getting more and more complex as the thing went along, and much of the complexity of language that would owe to these genetic responses to this cultural cultural expansion system, and the two would be tightly linked by this coevolutionary process. About the same time, a fellow named James Herford started writing on language, initially in the same vein, really, and but he organized at Edinburgh University a group of people who were interested in the evolution of language. So he formed a small team of people there. And they eventually, at least some of them, Simon Kirby et al., I've cited here, Simon Kirby and several of his colleagues have a quite different approach to the evolution of language. So they think that language mainly adapts to the existing cognitive capacities of humans, and that the amount of coevolution might be, when they're in a provocative mood, they say 0. We just started with human cognition that's evolved for other reasons, and then language adapts itself to be learnable by the human. So that the genetic, there's no, or it depends on how provocative they want to be. There's, but little or no genetic response to this coevolution. It's a language that has evolved to adapt to standing human cognition, and that the Pinker and Bloom style feedback is minimal. Mike Tomasello, developmental psychologist, I guess you might call him, with an evolutionary cast, wrote a book in 2005 that's something along the same lines. I mean, obviously there are things that have evolved in humans that are specialized for language. Our vocal tract, for example, and our ability to decode language on the fly. There's a bunch of things that are genetic about it, but he thinks that mostly, and humans are elaborately specialized cognitively to manage culture. We're the most imitative animal ever studied. We can, little kids can imitate what they see other kids or adults doing quite readily compared to chimpanzees. So that we've run up a whole lot of cognitive specialization for culture. And Tomasello thinks that there's nothing special about language. There's no, little or no cognitive specialization for language per se. It's just another cultural system. It's like technology or social organization. It's one of these several domains in which we transmit massive amounts of information from one generation to the next by cultural means. And there's nothing in that way terribly special about language. So, for example, one of the things that kids use and adults use as a tool for teaching language is joint attention. They pay attention to the same tasks, and so developmental linguists see that kids learn words when they use eye gaze. And so if a parent says ball and points to a ball, kids attend to what parents are pointing to, and other animals don't do this sort of thing. It's also, joint attention is something that people use for social tasks. So when people are engaging in a common social task, helping each other do some task, that's a joint attention task too. So that the joint attention process subserves language acquisition, but it also subserves acquisition of social things and technical skills. So when dad is tying knots and kids pay attention to dad tying knots, that's a kind of a joint attention thing too that doesn't involve language, but involves learning to tie knots or cooking or any number of tasks. Kids participate with their parents and learn things that way. And so that all of the hypotheses in the paper that this talk is based on, I review a bunch of these kinds of studies, and this is just a snapshot of those. There's quite a bit of interest in this, and all of the hypotheses that I've been able to find about the evolution of language are gene-cultured coevolutionary studies. And the big difference, as I tried to point out, is the sort of the division of cognitive labor. How much of the innate part of language is specialized to language, and how much innate stuff is there compared to what's the division of labor in language between what's culturally transmitted and genetically transmitted. So Chomsky himself has become a minimalist and thinks that there's very little that's transmitted genetically nowadays. And Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch have this well-known paper in 2002 in which they provide an evolutionary cast for this. And particularly the grammatical part of language, they think recursion, and Chomsky sometimes says merge. If you're a linguist, you know something about these terms. There are just a few things that are innate that are directly related to language. A fellow named Ted Briscoe is adamant that it's going to turn out to be a mixture of these things. A fair amount of innate substratum for language itself and a lot of cultural stuff. And so there's essentially the standing opinions as of today are all over the map in what the cognitive division of labor is. So that's a kind of a background. So my idea, this got me in maybe the biggest trouble I've ever gotten myself into in writing a paper for a book chapter. We had this conference, and so my contention in the conference was that cognition isn't from an evolutionary point of view, not the primary problem. The primary problem lies elsewhere. So this was a conference about syntax, and my paper essentially said that syntax is really very interesting, and given that most linguists think that syntax is the big problem, this landed me in hot water, and I wrote this paper, and I was rather firmly invited to please withdraw this paper from this conference, and I did. So I didn't want to press the issue, and I had another outlet for the thing anyway. So, and the linguist, to be fair, the linguist taught me at these two conferences I went to that I was an amateur, and the paper that I wrote was amateurish, and so I went back to the drawing boards, and what I hope it's more sophisticated now. But I still, to be on the provocative side, I do hold to this idea that focusing on the cognitive part of it from an evolutionary point of view is focused in the wrong place. And the argument basically is that complex communication is actually common in nature. In developmental circuits, as organisms develop, the genome has to signal to cells, and cells have to signal to each other, and there's an enormous amount of communication that's come to light in the developmental process. And that's another place where there's complex communication. The nervous and hormonal communications within the bodies of complex organisms like ourselves. I mean, our brain is shooting signals all over the body all the time, and pain sensors are shooting it back, and there's an enormously rich, high bandwidth communication system that keeps our complex bodies functioning. That's another one. The pheromonal communication systems of insects, the knowledge of these is exploding, particularly in the case of the honeybee, and I don't know where all that's going. It's people are identifying new compounds and trying to understand how these pheromones are emitted in various sequences by various castes. The decoding, you might say, of the honeybee pheromonal system is incomplete, but already we know it's really quite complex. Whether it's as complex as human language, we might doubt, but it's certainly very complex. Otherwise, the linguists are right. Most animals individual animals now, not talking about within bodies or not talking about social insects, but the common run of animals don't communicate much with each other at all. They have quite impoverished communication systems. So in terms of these things like developmental circuits and nervous and hormonal communication and pheromonal communication in social insects. I don't know if these have formal analogies to human language or not. That was an older controversy when the honeybee waggle dance was a big story. And I've just before I came on this trip, I was using Google Scholar to paw through the literature to find out if any linguists and honeybee pheromonal communications people had gotten together to see if they could make an argument or not about formal analogies to human language. And as near as I can tell, I haven't found anybody that's done. So from an evolutionist point of view, there's what we call the ultimate versus the proximate problem. The proximate problem is engineering a system that can communicate, a high bandwidth communication system, which is what human language is. The ultimate problem is how could selection favor such a thing? How could selection favor a complex communication system? As I said, between individuals, like languages between human individuals, rich communication systems of that kind are, if they exist at all, are restricted to the advanced social insects. There's an ultimate problem as well. However much you think the approximate problem is a problem, the actual psychology of getting the job done, the selection forces that would favor such a thing are a different problem. And evolutionists tend to think that the proximal problems, that's all in the details. Biology can do anything, that's not a big problem. So that's how I got in trouble with the syntax guys, was saying that they were doodling around with a problem that was easy and not very interesting from an evolutionary point of view. They didn't like to hear that, and that's understandable. So, but I do, however complex the proximal problem is or was, I mean, it could be that it was a problem. I want to look at this ultimate thing. How can evolution favor complex communication? Efficient communication requires and facilitates trust. This is an idea that turned out to be first well articulated by a fellow named Grice, who was a philosopher of language, wrote in 1975. And his argument basically was that if I'm not telling you something that is potentially of some use to you, you wouldn't listen, right? If you thought I was trying to use this lecture as a way to extort money from you or something, or I don't know, coerce you for sexual favors or whatever it would be, you wouldn't listen. And if, in general, if animals aren't saying something to one another that is in the hearer's interest, then the hearer isn't going to listen, and then the speaker isn't going to speak, and language won't evolve. And it turns out that the evolution of the trust necessary for complex communication to exist is hard to evolve. Evolutionary biologists have been interested in this for a long time. Lockman and Bergstrom wrote a paper about, this particular paper is about human language in particular, and they show that to my satisfaction, that in a simple mathematical model, it's really hard for something like this to evolve unless there's a lot of trust. So language doesn't evolve when trust is limited. So most animal signals are, the translation boils down to get the hell out of my territory, or I want you, baby, and a few very simple things like that. And so their animal communication systems are impoverished because most of the things that animals might say to one another would be deceptive. They don't have any interests in common. They don't trust one another. So how we get trust is crucial. So I'm going to explain to you how we think, Rob Boyd and I think, human trust arose. And then the other observation is that linguistic differences serve social functions. So from a purely communicative point of view, why wouldn't we have a really hardwired communication system? So everyone in the world would speak some nice, straightforward language, and it'd all be hardwired. Spanish, let's say, that's my best second language. It's much easier in some ways than English. It's perfectly good language. So why do we have this immense diversity of languages? 7,000 languages in the world. Why do we have dialect variation that grows up along these social fault lines? So William LaBeouf is a sociolinguist. He studied the evolution of dialect here in New York, among other places. And that was his observation, that create a little social fault line, class, region, and dialect variation will grow up to mark those social differences. Neville and Dunbar pointed to the idea that linguistic diversity has functions in simpler human societies. The groups that cooperate, that have trust, tend to speak the same language, or at least the same dialect. There seems to be a social function. Knowing how someone speaks, if someone comes up to you and speaks your dialect and your language, then you're liable to trust them, think they're okay folks. If, on the other hand, somebody comes up and speaks English to you in a dialect, you might be a little more suspicious. And if somebody comes up to you, comes up to me saying, speaks to me in Persian, I mean, I can't even understand what they're saying. So they couldn't fool me or trick me, because I can't even understand what they're saying. They couldn't use language to exploit me, in other words. So maybe the in-group, out-group functions are part of the cooperation. They mark the limits of cooperation in human societies. And so that's the tribal social instincts applied to language. And then ancestrally, we think these were literally tribes. Nowadays, of course, human groups have some of the similarities to tribes, but we have very much more complex social systems. So why isn't language common in nature? The signaling theory suggests that only costly signals will be selected, because the only way you can believe, some bison, this is a picture I took on a field trip with a friend of mine in Davis who was an expert bison. So the bison get out there and push each other around to see who's the biggest bison who gets to mate with the local females, and they roar at each other, and then they engage in these pushing contests, and basically the signals are correlated with size, and so how loud a bison can roar is correlated with his size, and if somebody's suspicious that this signal is being faked in some way, they'll go after them and push them around a little bit and find out if they really are any bigger. And so these signals are costly because, in this case, your bluff will be called. If you're a little bison who somehow manages to fake being a big bison, the bigger bison will try you out, and these fights get very nasty. A fair number of bulls every year die in these conflicts. The bison horns, you've seen the bison in the zoo, they have that kind of funny hook to the horn. Well, that turns out to be an adaptation. If one of these guys can get around to the side of the other guy, that horn is designed to be jabbed through the rib cage of the guy they're fighting. So the few percent of bull bison every year die in these contests. The frog up there, they make great big throat pad. They devote an enormous amount of energy and tissue to making the loudest noise that little teeny frog can make. And as we know, if little frogs can make quite a racket because they devote an immense amount of effort to it. And again, that's a costly signal, and only the biggest frogs can make the biggest noise. So then they attract the females that way. This is too clear in this light, but that's a bowerbird nest. You know about bowerbirds. They're not very colorful birds, but they make these elaborate nuptial tunnels and decorate them with stuff, and go to an immense amount of effort in Australia and New Guinea to make these houses that they're intended to attract mates. So you can't trust. Most animals can't trust cheap signals. So this is, I call this the Ulysses and the Sirens. Remember, Ulysses wanted to listen to the sirens, who were these beguiling, beautiful maidens with wonderful singing voices, but they were luring sailors to their death. So he had himself tied to the mast, and his sailors stopped their ears with wax, and then rowed Ulysses past the sirens. So the point here is that cheap signals, if you don't trust them, you just don't listen to them. So to get cheap, high information content signals, the hearer needs to trust the speakers. And so cells within bodies all have the same genotype. So the reason your liver cells trust your brain cells and so on, your muscle cells trust the brain signals that come down to make you move, is because the genes are in one body are all in it for the common good. So your cells implicitly trust the cells, the other cells in your body, and so the whole thing is a cooperative system, and trust between cells is extreme. Social insects are cooperative systems. This is magnetic termites. Magnetic termites, they make their nests out of magnetite, and they're lined up like compass-like from north and south. That's why all these tombstone-like nests out there are all lined up in the same direction. So the advanced social insects make these huge colonies and require lots of coordination, and primitively at least, these systems are genetically closely related to one another. So they're composed of brothers and sisters with a high degree of genetic relatedness, and so they have their genes pretty much in common, and so selection favors cooperation amongst kin by this mechanism of kin selection you've probably heard of. And so that's another system that can develop a lot of trust. The brain there is to emphasize that cells communicating with other cells are trusted. And well, there's honeybees there too. So now a little analysis of what do humans use language for? The psychologist Merlin Donald had this book in 1991 called The Origins of the Modern Mind, and it's a bit of a neglected classic, I think. And Merlin argues that humans can get a long ways down the road to being modern humans by mimesis, that just by imitating what other people do. So learning knots and all sorts of technological things where a picture's worth 1,000 words. You don't need language for that. So he thought that, and you could get a fair amount of social communication by pantomime and things of that kind. And so his question was, what do humans need language for? What do modern humans do that you couldn't get done just by a powerful imitation process based upon observational learning, doing what other people do? And his argument is that what people couldn't do is operate tribal scale social institutions. I mean, this might be good enough for family scale social institutions, which are relatively easy to organize anyway, but things like unilineal kinship systems. I don't know how many of your anthropologists have had an old-fashioned course in anthropology where kinship was emphasized, but lots of societies are socially organized around kinship systems that are unilineal, where you count your descent through, and this is a diagram of the Polynesian or conical clan system, where you're related only through your male ancestors. The social system is organized around rank that's transmitted only through male ancestors. So the eldest son of the eldest son of the eldest son of the founding ancestor is the paramount chief, and each of these lineages are increasingly junior lineages. So the second son of the founder founds a whole set of junior lineages, And so each second son founds more and more June lineages. So this is the lowest ranking lineages in the system here and the highest ranking there. You always know your place in the social hierarchy in this way. And it's hard to imagine how this kind of thing could be organized except by being able to tell kids how the system works and where they belong. And language is used in that way. It's also used to organize complex enterprises. So when we're making a plan to go off on a collective hunting or fishing expedition or warfare or making some complex social event, for example, people have to be assigned roles, and it has to be a lot of negotiation about who's going to do what. And it's hard to see how you can do that without a language. And then there's a social side to technology. Sometimes a picture isn't worth 1,000 words. Conservation. So for example, in training students, we don't just, you don't just go into the lab and watch what your major professor is doing. He gives you a lot of verbal feedback, and you write papers, and so for complex, do I want to restart my computer right now? No. Bill Gates and his spawn of hell after me. Right? They were after me earlier in the morning on a completely different computer. Just a little Microsoft paranoia that is after me today. And another thing that is very interesting along these lines, well, so oratory is very important in the organization of tribal society. So this is a New Guinea tribesman, an Engat tribesman, and he's one of the orators of the community, and he's in the midst of some complex political negotiations here, and he's got his feather raised there to signal that he wants to talk, and so talking things out in complex social systems. I mean, this is not complex by our standards, but it's complex enough, and so a lot of oratory is necessary. Things like boat building require master-apprentice relationships, and it's hard to imagine how you could get this. This is a lot like graduate education, the way boat builders are trained. It's hard to imagine how you do without that. Operations, hunting, tracking has been studied. Here's some San people, and they've got a GPS down here they're playing with, but they're extraordinarily good trackers, and tracking is a fellow named Louis Liebenberg who has written a great book on this, and he argues that it's a very social thing, that 3 or 4 expert hunters go out together, and there are all these ambiguous signs, and they're like scientists entertaining hypotheses, and they're discussing all the time what these ambiguous signs mean, and they're drawing tentative conclusions, and then they're finding more evidence, and they're discussing that. And so that kind of thing, it's hard to imagine how, as he describes it, how that could operate without language. I'm going to skip over this, well, maybe I won't. So we did some public goods experiments at Davis, and this just shows a setup. So the public goods experiment is you put people in a room, and it's the tragedy of the commons. Is everybody familiar with the concept of the tragedy of the commons? So this is an experiment on the tragedy of the commons. So we give everybody in the participants there in the experiment a sum of money. And then then there's 10 rounds, and each round they can contribute as much or as little as they want of their stake to the public good side of the economy. And whatever they contribute, we collect and divide and multiply by 2, and then divide equally amongst everybody, irregardless of their contribution. So this sets up a system in which there's an incentive to not contribute anything and hope everybody else contributes a lot, that you get to keep your original stake, you didn't invest any money, and you harvest your share of what all the other chumps in the experiment contributed. So this sets up a dilemma of cooperation, and this is meant to be a model of how human societies work, how cooperation works. So this is a widely used experiment, and what we did was run it with various forms of punishment. So there have been a number of experiments in which punishment is used to induce cooperation in this experiment. So people can pay to punish others. And in the ex post sanctions, which I'm going to focus on, after the round is over, then you can assign punishment to other people at a cost to yourself. And so you can, so this is from 6 groups. The yellow line here is just talk. We gave people the opportunity to talk by writing anonymous messages, and then we would read the messages aloud, so people could encourage others to cooperate, which is typically what happened. And then we combine these punishment things are combined with punishment. So you can, and so in most, the maximum contribution in each round is 10. And so you can see that people started out with middling contributions, and this is the baseline. The baseline just stayed static. But if you give people either punishment or communication, they use these as tools to organize cooperation. And this is the communication-only treatment, so no tools except communication. And the payoffs are pretty high. $10 was the maximum. So in one session, people were almost perfect from the beginning, and some of them were kind of raggedy. They had a lot of defectors in these groups, and so the defectors. You see the motivation here. The defectors actually earn more money than the cooperators. So there is a real dilemma of cooperation here. So that's communication only. If you mix communication with punishment, you get much more cooperation. Now the defectors are more or less deterred. But you notice that the average payoffs have dropped quite a bit because it's costly to punish, and so a lot of money is wasted on paying for cooperation, and on the part of the people who punish, they lose money because they're punished. So the point I want to make here is that communication is an efficient way of organizing cooperation in humans. We really do use it we really do use communication as a task to organize cooperation. Now, and there is the problem. So these defectors in their messages would say things like everybody should cooperate, knowing full well that if everybody else cooperated, they take away the most money. So deceptive communications are a real problem. We know this, of course. People lie to us and use language deceptively, and we have to be on our guard about that. So language itself has a dilemma of cooperation. Human communication, human social systems are unique, and so I wanted to go through a little discussion of how human social systems evolve. So we're docile, responsive to social reinforcement, engage in extensive cooperation between non-relatives, and we have large to very large groups, and they're imperfect and they're conflict-ridden, and we do have to manage what cooperation we achieve. And group selection hypotheses, selection at the level of groups, whole groups are a prominent hypothesis to explain this. If you are familiar with evolutionary biology, group selection hypotheses are very controversial. Humans are very different from chimps. This is out of a newspaper story about, there's a chimp haven there where people who try to keep chimps as pets, do you know this? It doesn't work. Little baby chimps seem like they're really neat to have as pets, and when they get to be about 2 years old, they get to be wild animals, and you can't keep them. This is Mo. This couple went to visit the chimp colony, where the chimp refuge, where they'd taken their pet chimp whom they still loved, and it was his birthday, and they were bringing him a birthday cake, and 2 other chimps escaped and mauled and killed the guy. It was quite a tragedy. But Mo himself, the nice chimp, he's still living in jail, basically, because behind bars, because chimps and humans can't get along. Chimps can't be trained. They can't be trained like dogs. They can't be house trained. They can't be trained to be nice. And Darwin, way back in the beginning, argued that that humans were a special case in which there was selection at the tribal level. So this is a passage from the Descent of Man. It must not be forgotten that although a high standard of morality gives but a slight or no advantage to each individual man and his children over other men of the same tribe, yet an increase in the number of well-endowed men and the advancement of the standard of morality would give an immense advantage of one tribe over another. So virtues like patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, always being willing to aid one another, sacrifice for the common good, those tribes would be victorious over others. And this is the basic idea of group selection, as opposed to selection at the level of individuals. So most animals don't cooperate and between individuals, or have minimal cooperation in small kin-sized units. And so we think we understand that. This is harder to understand what humans do. So I'm going to skip over a few things here because I'm going to run out of time if I don't. I'm just going to skip this, as interesting as it is. Cooperative behavior increases the average payoff to groups, and there are many examples in human society. So in hunting and gathering societies, food is shared amongst all the members of the camp typically, so there's cooperation in hunting and sharing of food. There's cooperation in the participation in warfare, and a lot of this warfare is actually pretty dangerous, so there really are costs. And trade requires trust on the part of people acting as principals and agents for one another, so there's a big element of trust and cooperation there. And then in the enforcement of moral rules, people are willing to punish altruistically, punish people who don't obey the rules, even when it's not, even when somebody else is doing the dirty deed. So there's third-party enforcement of moral norms, as we say. I'm going to skip this too because it's a little. I think I've already really said it, what needs to be said. So the question is, how can culture set up a system for cooperation? More broadly, the question is, how can humans be so much more cooperative? And this tribal social instincts argues that the primary mechanism of cooperation is a selection on cultural variation between groups. So cultural evolution, the part I skipped over, is that we think that the original advantage of social transmission of information is that it sets up a system of evolution that's faster than genes. So people can share information amongst one another, say, just horizontally. So if I get a good idea, I can communicate it to you guys, and I don't have to have kids who have that idea, and then all of you who don't have the idea have to die. That's a slow and difficult process. If I'm the only one person with the world's gone to hell, and I'm the only one person who's got the right idea to survive, then if it's genetic, all of you guys got to die, and my kids have to take over. That's the way it would work with genes. But culture's a lot faster because if there's a modicum of cooperation, I can tell you what the trick is, and none of you have to die. So that means that selection can go, or evolution can go a lot faster because it doesn't depend just on natural selection. It can depend upon cultural evolutionary processes. And also, so this means that if we separate two groups, they'll diverge rather quickly because cultural evolution is fast. So that'll set up differences between groups. Repeated social games have many equilibria. There are lots of different ways to organize societies, and any of us who've spent any time in another society find that the other society does all sorts of annoying things that are just different, you know. And so I had a friend who spent a lot of time, German friend who spent a lot of time in the United States, and I spent a lot of time in Germany, and we were sitting around his house one time and telling stories about what annoyed us about the other culture, what annoys Germans about America, and what annoyed us about Germany, and you know, the list goes on. And the more drinks you have, the more belligerent people get about it. It got to be a little touchy towards the end of the evening, because people take these differences seriously. forces that cut the effective rate of cultural migration can maintain variation between groups. So the assimilation of immigrants is like this. Kids learn the language of the dominant culture on the schoolyard and many other things. And there's typically immigrants assimilate more or less to their host culture. Again, so in the case of societies like ancient Rome, there was conquest, and then the people who were swept up in the conquest typically assimilated to Roman values, and Rome could expand much more rapidly because the immigrants were substantially becoming Roman, and that is a rapid way of building large societies that remain different from one another, because in genetic systems, immigrants carry their genes with them, and you can't, I see people around here who are probably perfect English speakers, but they've still got your genes from Asia, Africa, wherever. Your genes haven't changed, but your culture changes as readily, and so that means that the rate of cultural migration is much less than the rate of genetic migration from a technical evolutionary sense. So we can tolerate high rates of migration, and high rates of migration tend to make genes very uniform very quickly. So the upshot of it is that people are sort of pseudo-species. This was a term invented by the mid-20th century psychologist Erik Erikson. So we readily make new social units, and these can be quite stable and have a fair amount of difference one from the other. One of my students did this work. So he compared the amount of genetic difference between neighboring existing human groups. There's a lot of interest in genetics. And so this is, the neighboring groups are like Danes in English and that sort of thing, Italians and Austrians and neighbors. And so for the most part, the genetic differences between neighboring groups in the modern world is vanishingly small, way too small to support genetic selection on different groups. Danes and English, the Danes and the English fought like nuts, right? During the medieval period, the Danes came down and conquered parts of England, and the Anglo-Saxon English fought back. But there's nothing much can happen at the genetic level as a result of that intergroup competition, because there's no passing little genetic difference between Danes and English. On the other hand, this is from the World Values Survey, so now we have some way of estimating the the cultural difference between human groups, and it's much greater. So that there's much greater scope for cultural evolution by group selection, and so this is likely to be a more powerful force generating differences, and then secondarily generating large amounts of trust within groups. So the groups that cooperate and can trust one another are the ones that can win competitions between these groups when they're different, according to that mechanism of Darwin's that I suggested. FST is, if you're interested, is just the ratio of the variance the total variance is accounted for by between group differences. So that the denominator is the total variance, and the numerator is that portion of the variance that is between groups. So we see examples of this kind of thing in tribal societies. This is a famous example of the Nuer expanding in the 19th century at the expense of the Dinka. These are the people in southern Sudan who are in the newspapers over the last couple decades fighting the northern Sudanese government. And they're pastoral people who raid each other for cattle. And the Nuer were expanding at the expense of the Dinka until the British colonialists suppressed cattle raiding in around 1880. And there's a good story about why there was this difference. What was the cultural difference? The New Era and the Dinka turned out to speak the same language and are fairly closely related people. And so the New Era had bigger sovereign political units, and it was because they counted kinship back deeper. And the reason they counted kinship back deeper is because they had a high inflexible bride price. So for boys to get together, the number of cows they needed to get a wife, they had to tap a much larger set of relatives. And so the New Era had a much more elaborate kinship system, and they could use that when it came to fights. They tapped that same kinship system for warriors, and they could generally muster 2 or 3 times as many warriors in any given fight as the Dinka could, who didn't have that system. And so this generated enough cultural difference to make the New Era the more frequent winners of these fights, and so that's where the expansion came from. So that's just a sort of a micro-evolutionary example of this thing. Direct punishment allows for the minority to sanction defectors. So punishment can be used to sanction people who diverge from the social norms of a given group. A lot of variation between groups is institutionalized. There's a set of rules about how New Era should behave and about how Dinka should behave, and if you come to in a New Era wedding negotiation with not enough cows, you're out. You're not going to get a wife. If you came to this with the same number of cows in a Dinka marriage negotiation, that might be plenty. The Dinka also allow credit and other things. So they don't stop either, do they? Punishment is a way of maintaining, is a form of cooperation in which I may sanction someone for misbehaving, even though it's sort of none of my business, right? Somebody's robbing somebody else and I call the cops. That sort of thing will have a powerful tendency to maintain these institutional groups, differences between groups. And there are experiments along these lines. Do you have a question?
Yeah. It's about punishment. So if communication can be used to punish people, then how would that help increase trust?
Well, because you punish people who violate the rules of your society. So if it's just random punishment, if you just bullies who just punish people for their own purposes, or psychopaths who punish people because it's pleasurable, that won't do any good at all. It has to be people who are punishing people who violate the rules of society. That will penalize people who deviate from the rules of the society, and 2 different societies with different rules, it'll tend to maintain the differences. So this is an experiment in which the investigator allowed punishment in a public goods game, and then midway through, with the same people, shut off the punishment and the amount of cooperation collapsed. So there's an experimental argument that is controversial, I should say, that punishment is an important mechanism. And then there are these symbolically marked groups. So we have language, dialect, jargon that arises along with lots of other differences. So this is a group of New Zealanders with painted bodies, tribal markings that are symbolic of their participation in this particular tribal group. We made, one of our colleagues made a mathematical model of the evolution of social markers. So in this model there are social interactions that are governed by 1 of 2 alternative social norms. And this is a game of coordination. You have one marriage system in one society and a different one in a different society, and they may be both equally good, but mixing and matching is bad. If you have a polygynous marriage system, you know what the marriage contract is, you know what you're getting in for. If you have a monogamous one, same thing. If people from a monogamous society try to marry into a polygynous society, that may cause problems. And then we allow neutral markers to evolve. The markers themselves have no evolutionary effect, but they can cause people to conform to one or the other of the two systems. And there's population structure, there are a number of social groups, and people move between the groups. And so you can start this thing off, and you can evolve a correlation between the behavior and the marker. So you can see here that we start these things off, they're only a little bit different at the start, but in one society, a correlation between behavior one and marker one evolves, and even though at first it seems to go the same direction here, and eventually group two evolves the opposite. So now everybody knows that if there's a migrant from one group to another, everybody knows whether you belong to this group or this group, because the marker trait is correlated with the behavioral variant. And so this is a reason groups have different social norms, different games of coordination, and you don't want to coordinate with people that are at the opposite equilibrium. So the classic game of coordination is driving on the right hand versus the left hand side of the street. So it doesn't matter, right, whether you drive on the right hand side or the left hand side, as long as everybody else in the society is doing the same. There's hell to pay if you try to match. You know, if there's no rules, or you're in a society where half the people are driving on the left hand side of the road and half the people are driving on the right hand side of the road, that's not going to work. So if we think there are a lot of things like that going on in societies, and the evolution of these symbolic markers will regulate that. If the assortment is strong enough, if people who have one marker get together with people who have another marker more strongly enough, you can get the evolution of castes within a society. So these are two societies that are geographically in the same place, but the individuals assort to play their games based upon their neutral marker. And then you can have two groups that are geographically one on top of the other that maintain these differences in behavior correlated with the differences in symbolic markers. And we have all sorts of examples of that. So things like occupational specializations. You can always tell an economist, right? They're more likely to wear a tie, they're more likely to wear a three-piece suit, they're more likely to give little hints about their right-wing opinions, and it doesn't take too long to ferret out whether a person belongs to a different, even scientific discipline than you belong to, and you can adjust your behavior accordingly. And people don't talk to one another in different groups as much as they talk to people within groups. So these symbolic boundaries really do reduce the flow of information between groups. I don't have time to explain this little experiment to you, but that's the upshot of it. And the final idea here is that genes shape cultural evolution, that over the long haul, genetic evolution is partly controlled by genes partly control cultural evolution. What feels good, we favor, and so we can get a lot of shaping of cultural evolution by what genes people have, psychological attributes, life history characteristics. And there's a big industry in evolution applied to humans that makes this point quite strongly. It's my own fault here. But the opposite is also true. Culture can shape genetic evolution. So people have been pretty cultural animals for at least 250,000 years, maybe quite a bit longer. And cultural processes create novel environments. They set up things like language. They set up large-scale cooperation in which you might get punished if you don't behave according to the rules. They set up this extensive symbolic marking between groups. If you behave like an out-group member, you're going to liable to get treated badly. They set up it may lead to the evolution of novel genetic adaptations like moral sentiments, shame and guilt, and docility and ethnic essentialism, which then become, there's a feedback process. As people become adapted to living in tribal groups and adapted to thinking that in-group, out-group psychology, be good to people in your in-group, be suspicious or even hostile to people from out-groups, that can become ingrained in our genes. But if Rob and I are right, the original mechanism is this cultural evolutionary mechanism that caused first genetic change, first cultural changes that then our genes adapt to. We have some excellent examples of culturally induced genetic change. The quite convincing ones. The best worked out one is adult lactose absorption in a historically dairying population. Do people know this story? Do I need to elaborate it? The basic idea is that people from historically dairying cultures secrete the enzyme lactase as adults, so we could digest the milk sugar lactose. And people from so this is the peoples mainly of Northern Europe, and also a number of African societies that have been pastoralists for a long time. East Asians, for example, with no history of dairying, mostly they shut down their secretion of lactase as they become adults, and this is the primitive state. Mammals generally shut down lactase. We got no use for that enzyme after we're weaned in most cases, but in dairying societies there's use for lactose after in adulthood. The selection on this, the estimated selection on this turns out to be extremely strong for reasons that are not entirely clear, but I can go into that. So I've got a, sorry I didn't call as many slides out of this presentation as I should have. So just to skip over a few things that are of only modest importance. The conclusions here are that language is part of a larger co-evolved complex of social instincts and social institutions, and the language capacity and language diversity are entrained in this tribal social instincts process, the way in which we evolved by culture-led mechanisms, we think, Boyd and I think, to become this highly cooperative species. Once we're cooperative, we've got a use for language, but because cooperation was generated by selection at the tribal level, we're evolved to be suspicious of people in other tribes. It's not to say that we are just crazily hostile to people in other tribes. The out-group business doesn't go that far, but we're guarded at least with out-groups, and out-groups signaled by language, among other things. So language depends upon cooperation. It also facilitates cooperation, I've argued. It's part of this co-evolving complex. And language differences to reduce communication and cooperation between groups reflects the fact that the ancestral locus of selection for these traits for cooperation was at the level of tribes, not at larger levels or smaller levels. And the argument here is that culture played a leading, not a lagging role in the evolution of much human cooperation. So the standard sort of story about the relationship between genes and culture that many people think is a sort of an inescapable story, is a reductionist story in which genes created human nature and then human nature controls culture. This, if you want to put it this way, if you want to think of it this way, turns that whole thing around. So if to use it language that I don't usually use. You can think of this gene-culture coevolution argument with culture leading as a kind of a social constructionist idea that human nature was socially constructed by cultural evolution. And it just inverts the standard idea that human nature comes first and culture comes after, and that genes are in the driver's seat and culture is the sort of prisoner. There's this metaphor that E.O. Wilson used, the leash metaphor. So the metaphor is that genes are the owner and the dog is on the leash and humans are leading the dog around. And sometimes I use this a panel from this Marmaduke cartoon. How many people are familiar with the Marmaduke cartoon? I see a few. Young folks don't read the newspapers, and so all these comics and things are lost on you. So the Marmaduke thing. Marmaduke is a Great Dane, and Marmaduke is a big, willful dog. And one of the standard sight gags in Marmaduke is the Marmaduke's owner being pulled along and dragged through the mud by Marmaduke. So if you think of the leash metaphor, it's not a toy. The culture is not a toy poodle at the end of that leash. It's Marmaduke, and the genes are being drug around by culture at least as much as culture is being drug around by genes. All right. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Pete. I believe we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Yes?
A couple of comments. One thing that you mentioned, language variation or difference involved in order to reduce the cooperation between groups. But I think it might have evolved differently. It might be the byproduct of isolation of different groups, rather than intentionally in order to reduce the communication and collaboration between groups.
Well, I think that both things happen. Because cultural evolution is rapid, if you get groups that are isolated, they will evolve differences at a quite rapid rate. So compared to biology. So we think in biology that speciation often happens because two groups are geographically separated. They evolve in isolation for a long period of time, and then when they come back together, either their biology and their behavior is so different that they just can't even mate, or if they do mate, the offspring are inviable or at least maladapted because by now these two species have somewhat different niches, and so speciating barriers will arise. So you could have exactly that same scenario for culture, except it would happen faster. You wouldn't have to isolate the groups as long before they came back together. But I'm sorry I didn't have time to explain it in enough detail. But these models are models of groups in contact with one another. And we start them off at very similar initial conditions, so they're not very different at the beginning. And then the migration process is occurring. So in this case, we can get these groups diverging, even though they start off similar. So these would be two groups that, well, think of it, a simpler model that Rob and I made years ago that has the same basic dynamic. We imagine an ecological gradient, say in Africa, from warm, wet forest to hot, dry environments, and along this gradient would be adapted to employ different mixtures of pastoralism and farming, animal raising. In Africa, in wet areas, there are tsetse flies, and you can't raise cows. In dry areas, there's not enough water for farming. So you get, at the ends, you get the sort of pure types of horticulturalists who only farm, and in the dry end, cattle keepers who don't raise any crops at all. And then across the ecological gradient, you get all sorts of mixtures. So if you imagine you're in a village and you've got flanking villages in a different part of the ecological gradient, you don't want to listen too much to people that live in a different ecological system because they've got bad ideas as far as you are concerned. And in that system also, you get the same kind of thing. You can get the evolution of, they'll diverge on this neutral ethnic marker, and the evolutionary pressure to do that is that people, to speak anthropomorphically, we're talking about people, to speak in intentional terms, I don't want to listen to people upstream in the gradient and downstream in the gradient because they have bad ideas, and so you'll get the evolution of dialect markers or something like that.
But that's only after the secondary contact, occurred. But originally, the language is different and the behavior difference was not different in the population. I think that was, the product of isolation. Only when they came together, because they already involved different language and different behaviors and a different culture, they do not contact with each other. They do not want to cooperate with each other.
Well, I guess what I'd say is that would make it easier and quicker. It turns out that, well, there's no time scale here, but you can see this divergence is fairly slow. And in fact, in the model that Rob and I made, if you start with 0 differences between these two groups, you just, you got a village here, and they're pioneering, and every few generations the village splits and half move off to the new habitat. No initial difference at all. They're just each a random sample of the maybe a large random sample. So there's passing little difference between the two groups. They will diverge. Now, admittedly, your intuition is at least half right, or if not 3/4 right, because the initial divergence is very slow. Building up this correlation between the adaptive character and this marker character is very slow at the beginning. So if the groups happen to be already different, then the difference will be maintained or even increased. So there's a lot to your intuition, but you still can't technically get it going just with two groups that start out identical.
Well,
That are in contact all the time.
This looks like a genetic drift model in our body very much. Genetic drift, probably heard of it.
Genetic drift.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in genetic drift, different population, subdivided population, if you allow each of them to evolve, at the end they can evolve. They can come out very different.
Very different. Yeah.
But another comment I would like to make is, as a biologist, I do not buy the idea, even though this idea has been very common in biology as well as in anthropology or the other parts of social studies, that is, everything is determined by a gene. Even morality, human behavior, all kinds of things is determined by a gene. I do not buy this idea, particularly morality. So you mentioned that there might be some selections for guilt or shame that become stuntmen, but I don't think that's really drives human evolution.
Yeah, well, essentially our argument is that you can't get human morality by direct selection on genes, that you need this cultural evolutionary mechanism to generate the variation that's necessary for selection to operate at the level of societies as a whole. And part of the argument is, that I tried to make very briefly by referring to chimpanzees, is our closest living relatives have a certain amount of cooperation based upon kinship and reciprocity, but they don't do anything on the scale that they don't develop moral systems that we would understand as human beings. We'd have humans adopted by chimpanzees would have a hell of a time becoming good chimpanzees, and chimpanzees adopted by humans can't become good humans. But that suggests that there is a genetic substratum to human social psychology. I think there are things like, so humans are, by comparison to chimpanzees, we're very susceptible to social reinforcement. If people tell us we're bad or tell us we're good, this means something to us.
But that's only because we already got used to this system. We're familiar with this system.
Well,
Others are not.
Right. So I think our argument is that there may very well be some genetic elements that make us feel good when somebody says that we're good, and feel bad when somebody tells us we're bad. But that's evolved by gene culture coevolution. That could never have been evolved by selection on genes alone. They got selected because people lived in environments where there were primitive social rules, and people had enforced those primitive social rules, and then this social environment, partly culturally constructed social environment, made it advantageous for your genes to adapt to that social environment. So things like shame and pride when you're praised, those kind of things that make us susceptible to social reward, were secondarily embedded in our genes, if you want, by this coevolutionary process. So it was the selection of the cultural environment. From the genes point of view, it was just ordinary natural selection. There's this social environment out there, and if you're behaving in grossly deviant ways, nobody will marry you, or in the worst case, people will kill you or ostracize you. So in simpler human societies with self-help violence, people who are psychopaths, behavior geneticists tell us there's still genetic variation for those kinds of traits, and in similar human societies, psychopaths were typically, if they couldn't clean up their act, they were assassinated by the other guys. Some guy's a big bully, causing a lot of trouble. Maybe he's a big guy and really tough, and people get tired of this, and so the other guys will get together some dark night and wait till about 2 a.m. when this guy's sound asleep and sneak up on him and stick him full of spears. This is what they do. And if there's genetic variation for that kind of thing, then you've been an agent of natural selection when you stick the spear in that guy. And now we incarcerate people in institutions, which has the effect of removing them from the mating pool, right? And so there's ongoing selection against psychopathy, I would argue.
So the strong argument against that gene determining of morality is, for the same person, if over lifetime, his gene or her gene would normally not change, except this that's a different subject. But his morality or her morality will change dramatically. In one society, if he used to live in one society, he might have a different kind of moral code. But when he moved or she moved into another society, she might have, or he might have a very different moral code.
Sure.
So even though the gene does not change at all.
Right, yeah, so that's the cultural evolutionary part of it, and we all do this, right? When we go to visit another culture, we try to figure out as best we can what the mores of that culture are, and conform as best we can, even as, I worked in my younger life in Peru as a scientific project, and so, you do your best to fit into Peruvian mores because you get along with Peruvians a lot better if you make at least a gesture of an attempt to conform to the differences between their moral code and ours. And so we can, as individual humans, make big adjustments in that direction. And if we come to another culture as little kids, we can make a nearly complete adjustment to another culture. There's not much, if any. There aren't any. The American Constitution isn't in our genes, and the Confucian ideas of the Far East aren't in Japanese and Chinese genes, as far as we know. I mean, there might be a little bit, but not enough to prevent us from learning other. There's another question.
Well, I actually wanted to add something on the topic of morality. There's a lot of discussion going on. So I have other questions for you. I'm actually a psycholinguist, professor in the psychology department here. But my graduate student, Kendall Estheim, he just published a paper in Psychological Science. The title of the paper is A Bad Taste in the Mouth, Gustatory Influences on Moral Judgment. And what we actually did, the study's actually gotten a lot of attention in the media, and the college is going to be doing a feature on us, but we've been cited in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, New Scientist, MSNBC, Scientific American. And what we showed in this study was actually that our moral judgments really seem to be rooted in our physiological sense of disgust. And we did this taste manipulation where we had people drink a bitter substance. Water was our control condition, or a sweet substance, and people that have a bitter substance made harsher moral judgments. So it seems like the degree to which we find something morally objectionable or not, and it goes with this whole idea of embodied cognition. Our cognitions are rooted in our perceptual motor experiences, is really related to how disgusting it physiologically makes us feel. And so, I mean, some of that's probably encoded in our genes, like he's saying, but then we did this just like college students here. North Americans, so there's probably a cultural element to it too. But the interesting thing about the study is we found that it depends on political orientation. So conservatives, actually, and this goes along with whole bunch of research, show the effect a lot stronger than liberals, which means that conservatives might be more sensitive to these kind of extraneous perceptual pieces of information in making moral judgments.
Right, so I think that that these cultural systems work by putting hooks into these really basic biological, emotional kinds of things. I mean, it's a commonplace that people have different disgusts with regard to food tastes. I've gone to these Argentinian barbecue places. You ever been to one of those? Or entrails, sweetbreads, about half the stuff or more on offer is stuff that I can get down, but I don't enjoy. So I go to an Argentine, the first time I went, I thought, lots of steak and stuff, and I wasn't imagining that I was going to get, sections of intestine, tripe, and stuff along with it. And food disgusts and preferences. The Scandinavians eat those dreadful pickled fish that look like they seem like they ought to kill you, and so on it goes. What is it that? There's a million of those things. So when I was in Peru on that project, I discovered that Peruvians really don't make any aged cheese. So they're disgusted by cheeses that we think are perfectly normal. Just like cheddar cheese and things are rotten milk. They think they're disgusted by it. And what they do, what you can get are these fresh cheese, farmer cheeses that are just coagulated milk pressed together. No aging, no nothing. That's cheese to a Peruvian. And so one of Rob's and my favorite stories is along these lines is the difference between Northerners and Southerners with regard to when violence is acceptable or not. And the culture of honor. Psychologist named Dick Nisbet and his student Dov Cohen wrote a book in the mid-90s on this. So Southerners, one of their experiments was they had a long, narrow room, and it was one of these sham experiments that psychologists do. And there was in the middle of the thing there was a file drawer, and a guy that was Confederate of the experimenters was operating this file drawer, and they had Northern and Southern students. It turns out a lot of Southerners go to Michigan, so you get a pretty large sample of Southern men from Southern backgrounds. And so that one of the experiments has Northerners and Southerners walking by this guy on their way to a room at the end of the hall where things are taking place. and the one of the treatments for both northern and southern subjects is that they just walk by and this guy moves aside and they go by. And the other one is they come by, he pulls out a little bit and they have to brush by him. And as they brush by, he turns around and mutters asshole at them. And then at the end of the hall, a bunch of things happen, different things, different experiments happen. But one of the most interesting things, they have them spit in a test tube, and then you can assay hormones in a test tube. So on the order of a minute after this relatively mild insult, you have them spit in a test tube, and they measure cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and testosterone, which is a fight and flight hormone, and the northerners, nothing. It's just nothing happens. You know, somebody like me from the north, somebody bumps into you and says asshole. I mean, what's his problem? The southerners, on the other hand, their cortisol and their testosterone spike, and they did a bunch of other experiments. So in one experiment, they used a handshake, and the person judged the firmness of the handshake. So if southerners have been insulted, they grab your hand, and the northerners, again, no difference. And then one of the cleverest behavior experiments, they recruited a Michigan linebacker, big, tough football player, and so his assignment, then the participants exit the room and go back down the same hall. So his assignment was to not to actually run over anybody, but to walk up right down the middle of the hall until the other person stepped aside, or he was about to knock him over. And northerners step aside whether they were insulted or not at about 6 feet. They pull conspicuously over to the side so that there'll be room to pass. And uninsulted southerners actually move over about 9 feet, I think. So this is a southern politeness. They know that other people out there are touchy, and so everybody's kind of, so they're respectful of other people that might be mad. And but if they've been insulted, they just walk right up and come up to within about 3 feet before they move aside. So one lesson we took away from that is, in terms of things like disgust, is that these cultural things put big, deep hooks into your emotions. It's not all this cognitive stuff floating up there. The hooks are down into your emotions. And in terms of, I think you're maybe referring to Jonathan Haidt's experiments.
We used stimuli, yeah.
Yeah, and so liberals are sort of trained to not to have disgust as it's one of their, it's down-regulated in liberals relative to conservatives. And so, I mean, we're people of the world, you're New Yorkers here, what are you disgusted by? Well, not common.
We have a hard time finding enough conservatives actually
to do your experiment.
We, in the end, still aren't perfectly equal, but we have some interesting follow-ups, which I would say, but I don't want to, just in case any of the students in here end up being our participants.
I think we can take another question from the
sure. You mentioned the divergence of dialects in adjacent or contacting populations. Do you consider professional jargon in modern societies to be an example of that?
Yeah, exactly. I worked as a contractor for EPA one time, Environmental Protection Agency. I was my other half of my career as an environmental scientist, and EPA generated this blizzard of jargon, so which you had to master to deal with them. So this was part of the socialization of dealing with what we were doing was RIFSs, and it took RI/FS, and it took me a long time to master that. Remedial investigation / feasibility study was what we were doing. Now, why didn't you just say remedial investigation? This is, to me, it's completely gratuitous, and it's meant to, I mean, I don't think any individual deliberately does this, but it separates insiders from outsiders. And so if some citizen comes into a public forum and fumbles with the EPA jargon, they know they're politically unsophisticated and they can ignore if they come in and toss around RIFS like an EPA, then they know that they're, even if they're adversaries, that they at least know the jargon and they're part of the larger conflicting community. And you complain about this, and you might they look at you like you crawled out from under a rock. It's really part of their thing. The other thing I get because of my modest fame, I guess, I get a lot of, I'm on a lot of email lists, and so I get invitations to come to scientific meetings. And it's surprising the number of emails you get that you're asked to come to the XYZ convention. Now, the first thing I want to know is, I mean, is this anything I could conceivably be interested in? And the acronym is repeated throughout the email, and I end up having not the foggiest idea what the XYZ Society is. I have no idea if I'm interested in this, could conceivably be interested in this meeting or not. And people just fall into this habit of generating a jargon. Academic disciplines are really bad at this, and bureaucratic agencies do this, and it's just rife, and it's part, I think, of the readiness of which we construct these symbolic differences whenever there's a social group, even an artificially created one like a scientific discipline or a government bureaucracy. It acquires this in-group, out-group, symbolic marking of in-group and out-group just within a decade or two. It just
Would you say that an explanation for this would be that, I don't know, this is something I've heard, that if you have clear ways of marking insiders versus outsiders, this reduces the cognitive load of distinguishing between those?
Right, but then the question is, why do we care about where does the cognitive load, where does that bite in terms of something that's important? Now, it could be just pure cognitive load in the sense that outsiders are talking about a bunch of things that you don't really care about and aren't important to you, and so just walling off extraneous information is that's a sort of a weak form of this mechanism that I talked about, where people in that other group are doing things differently in a way that's of no use to you. So you're a doctor and they're lawyers and they got a bunch of jargon and a bunch of ideas are floating around, and you really don't want to know about that because it's irrelevant to being a doctor, and vice versa. So that's kind of a modern version of living on an ecological gradient, and those guys are keeping too many cows, and the guys down there in the wetter area aren't keeping enough cows, and so you want to get involved in conversations that are relevant to you, not extreme.
Well, the kind of thing I'm talking about is, for example, let's say if you're some sort of specialist in some field, and someone comes up to you and starts talking about your field. If there's no jargon, you might not easily be able to tell that they are not a specialist, and you end up possibly wasting a lot of your time and effort that could be used elsewhere. Or in a more primitive society, someone, says something to you, is talking to you about things that are relevant to you, and you end up wasting a lot of your time that you could be using to increase your reproductivity somewhere. Whereas if there's jargon, you can just easily determine that
what they got to say is not useful to you. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what's going on. Yeah. Now,
There was a question there.
Yeah, I have a question. So what are the origins of the arbitrary properties of different languages or different cultural traits?
say that again?
What's the origin of different arbitrary properties of different languages?
Yeah, the actual arbitrary properties of the languages themselves.
Yeah. For example, the case marking agreements.
there's a wonderful discipline of or what do I say, a school of historical linguistics. It's called grammaticalization. It runs under the term of grammaticalization. And they're particularly interested in how new grammar arises. And I mean, to make a much longer story short, their thesis is that we get new grammar when old ways of saying things become sort of trite, and people get tired of old ways of saying things, and they say new things. And some of the things they say are for emphasis, others are for contraction. So I guess older Middle English lacked that. We lost the ancestral what is it? Is it the dative case that's for possession? Do I remember that from my schoolboy German? Anyway, the possession is indicated by a grammatical structure that involves the article in front of the word. So I can't do it anymore. I could give you an example, but so you would say Pete's University would be Dame University Pete. So it's there's a case, the grammatical case that indicates possession on the part of the subject of the sentence, and that disappeared from English sometime. And then so we had to have some other way of denoting possession, and then the way you would say it, you used a lexical device to indicate it. So you would say Pete his school, and that became contracted to eventually to Pete's school. And so the apostrophe S is now technically it's a grammatical marker. But it used to be it's a contraction of what was once a lexical way of doing it. So English has relatively little case marking, and so we have to do all of that with word order or other ways. And in this particular thing, we use it with the apostrophe S to indicate possession. So that's a grammaticalization, and so languages tend to diverge in lexicon and syntax by these methods. And if you're interested, there's a nice book I like it at any rate, by a historical linguist by the name of Guy Deutscher, who talks about this kind of stuff in some detail, and has a whole theory of how languages diversify based upon these kinds of principles.
There was a question there.
How does the fact that having children with a person whose genetics are significantly different from yours pose a culture, a genetic advantage, an evolutionary advantage? How does that mesh with this pseudo-speciation idea?
Well, I think they're substantially independent. There's a very so a person might be substantially genetically different than yourself. Biologically speaking, if you think of the whole range of biological possibilities, there's a lot of things that can happen. When you mate animals that are too distantly related to one another, you get something called hybrid dysgenesis. In other words, the offspring are poorly adapted because of you've got they're too different, and there's a bunch of confusion in development, and adaptations don't get developed. So there's in Darwin's day, Darwin confronted this in The Descent of Man. Of course, he didn't know anything about genes, so the mechanics of it were missing. But so the argument on the part of many people, racists basically, as we would say today, was that the different human races were different species. And so Darwin goes on for a long time in his chapter on the races in The Descent of Man. He lays out, takes about 8 or 10 pages to lay out this argument, and then he turns around and demolishes it. And basically his demolishment is that, I was on the voyage of the Beagle. I traveled around. saw these Afro-Caribbean people, and I saw these South Americans that were half Native American and half Spanish or so. He said, works fine, no hybrid dysgenesis. And I saw these people, the men work hard, the girls look good. I mean, what's not to like? So that was his demolishment of the idea that the races were separate species. I love the argument because it's so clearly laid out, and even in the 19th century, it didn't take anything but open eyes to see this. In terms of then the cultural differences, so one of my colleagues, actually one of Rob Boyd's students, worked in Western Mongolia, where there are two ethnic groups, ethnic Mongolians and ethnic Kazakhs. And there the problem with interaction between these two people is they have very different social mores about things that are not very important, but they can be very annoying. So the Kazakhs are into one of their social things is rough teasing. So men tease each other unmercifully about their sexual prowess and anything that Mongols are extremely polite and uptight about things like that. I mean, they're really nice and they're formal, and they would never call your manhood into question just for fun. I mean, this is just out beyond the beyond as far as Mongols are concerned. And then on the female side of things, Mongol women keep very neat households. Everything in its place. Sweep the hut every day. Really uptight that way. And I suppose that the Kazakhs, a rough teasing also goes on between husbands and wives, although that wasn't part of Francisco's story. The Kazakhs are pretty hang loose about. I get the feeling that a Kazakh yurt looks about like my office. There's some order there. There's nothing dysfunctional about my office, I would argue, although some might disagree. But his idea was that a marriage between a Mongol and a Kazakh would be big trouble because they just have these clash of cultures over things that aren't, in this case, probably really very important, but would be really annoying. So the idea is that the more general idea is that we have all of these differences between in games of coordination, which side of the street you drive on, how clean you keep your house, norms about teasing and norms about how many wives you can have and how tight marriage bonds are. Or do women have the liberty to leave guys and pick up with other guys, or does that cause big problems? Essentially, there's a bunch of these kind of conventions that each society has, and when you get to a situation where you have to mix and match these things, then you have to reach a whole bunch of individual decisions. It puts an enormous burden on, say, a married couple to negotiate these things. As far as the genes are concerned, no worries about genes. They seem to, in fact, there might be a little hybrid vigor, right? The more different the person you marry is, you might have, humans don't ever, as far as I know, have ever been shown to verge over into the area where there's hybrid dysgenesis on the genetic side. But there's a sort of analog of hybrid dysgenesis on the cultural side if you think that anecdotes like these ones from Mongols and Kazakhs are generalized to other things. Of course, most of the, well, I don't know. I don't want to go there.
I think we have time for just one last question, which I think it was good.
My question is about these between group differences. We were talking about different ways in which they might arise, either through isolation or
Active process.
Right. And so in a scenario where we have hunter-gatherer societies, and there's a lot of exchange of mates between groups, do we find, or has anyone looked at whether these kinds of active modes of differentiation become more common there, so that people are able to distinguish between groups despite the fact that they're exchanging people between groups?
That's a good prediction of these models, is that the more migration there is, if there's no migration, two groups that are next to one another, for whatever reason there's no migration, then you don't need any symbolic markers of difference, do you? I don't know exactly how that situation would arise, but take it as a hypothetical. On the other hand, if the migration rates are too high, even these mechanisms I talked about, they'll never get started. They're hard to get started, so they never get started. If the migration rates are high enough, you could never get the evolution of these things. And if you started with differences, they're liable to be erased if there's too much migration. It'll swamp those processes that are tending to maintain the variation. So that you have to get this evolution of those symbolic differences, you have to have a lot of migration, but not too much migration. And there's a window there of migration rates that will allow those processes to arise. Is that an answer to your question, or is there more to it?
It is. I was wondering if there have been empirical studies.
Yeah, empirical studies. Yeah. Sorry, I started with that part of it in mind. The short answer is no. As far as I know, if you mean solid quantitative data. Now, the best examples that I know of are kind of semi-quantitative, and they're the sociolinguists the School of Linguists, sociolinguists that were started by this fellow William LaBeouf. He was an engineer by training, and so he collected back in the late 50s and 60s. He collected speech from people, a recorded speech, and then subjected it to spectral analysis so that you could really study the differences between individual idiolects, it's called, in quite some detail. And so it's the linguistic part of it is very sound, but they didn't, and they have these sociological arguments that they make that are based upon essentially ethnographic observation. So the sociological motivation for the sound changes that they observed. So the sound changes are very clean and quantitative because comparative linguists have reduced comparing dialects to a science long ago, and so that part of it is good. Very much more generally, there's a dearth of microevolutionary studies where you try to put the whole package together. What are the cultural variants? What are the environmental drivers of the evolving differences? And the sociolinguists have a good story to tell about this, but the environmental drivers part of it, the sociological part of the story, is better than anecdotal, but it's ethnographic. So at Philadelphia, for example, one of the case studies was Philadelphia. So there was the Philadelphian people spoke one of these general northeastern dialects until World War II, and then there was a big influx of African American workers from the South into the war plants in Philadelphia, and in the jargon of the sociolinguists, this set the dialect in motion. So the white Philadelphians started to develop a distinctive Philadelphian dialect. Another example is Martha's Vineyard. The people on Martha's Vineyard that's off Cape Cod, they spoke the standard New England, Kennedy, Boston kind of dialect, indistinguishable. They know this, interestingly, they know this because there were, during the 30s, one of the things that a lot of scholars were put to work on on make-work projects, and there was a big dialect survey done in the U.S. and these, by that time, already quite sophisticated dialect people went and did a dialect geography of the United States. They did it all by ear, but a good trained linguist can do that. And so they had the background. They interviewed people on Martha's Vineyard, and you could go back to Martha's Vineyard today and interview the same old people that were surveyed, had been surveyed at that time about 30 years before, and they were still speaking the same dialect. And then you could look at younger people, and you could see that the younger people were progressively changing their dialect, and they were doing it on Martha's Vineyard. The argument was because Martha's Vineyard became a tourist thing, and people rented out their houses in the summertime. And generally speaking, people don't like people in the tourist industry really don't like serving tourists very much, because most of them are to varying degrees obnoxious to the people that they deal with, and many of them, as we know, are very obnoxious. So they were the Martha's Vineyard dialect had begun to diverge. Interestingly, kids who expected to stay on Martha's Vineyard were participating in this dialect evolution. Kids who were expecting to go to college and so on and eventually end up off the island weren't diverging. They were still conforming more to the standard New England dialect. So it's really neat. One of the, it's just a fun factoid, the leaders of dialect evolution are adolescent girls. So there's all these language mavens who think that language is really important, and they're usually working class or lower middle class girls. So language evolution is in the hands of lower middle class girls, and all the fancy academics, and there are all these people that they're usually conservatives of one kind or another who think that people are speaking impure English, and there's all this resistance on the part of certain conservative, mainly conservative pundits to the evolution of language, and it's just to linguists it's comical because you can't fight it. The languages are evolving things, and the idea that there's correct English that is can be maintained. The French try to do this. They have this whole academy, and they have a whole bureaucracy devoted to keeping the French language pure, and they might as well be, I don't know, they might as well be trying to stop the tide coming in with a teaspoon there. So that there's something, I don't know, I think that's sort of a perverse pleasure in the fact that it's lower middle class girls that are causing the evolution of language. It's not us.
The only known way of stopping language evolution is not to speak the language.
Like a dead language, church Latin or something.
Thanks everyone for coming.